One night, the German philosopher Schopenhauer goes out walking, his legs moving briskly over the street and his mind riveted on the big questions that engross philosophers. Along comes a police officer, suspicious of this odd-looking fellow wandering in the dark. The officer approaches Schopenhauer and says, "May I know who you are?" The silence stretches around them, and at last Schopenhauer replies, "I wish I could tell you." Little did the officer know that he had posed one of the great existential questions. What am I? Who am I? The answer to this question profoundly affects how we go about our own life and how we interact with other people. What is the nature of a human being? To watch children being torn from their mother's arms by ICE agents in recent months, we might easily agree with Thomas Hobbes that human life can be nasty, brutish, and short. Theologians have sometimes taken a dim view, too. In the Christian tradition, St. Augustine introduced the doctrine of original sin, embedding in the Jesus tradition a pessimistic view of human nature that I haven't read Jesus professing anywhere. Later, during the Protestant Reformation, John Calvin took a further turn to the dark side of human nature, emphasizing the total depravity of a humankind that is forever alienated from God. If you attended the fundraiser event for our Kathy McConnell Music Fund last Monday, where, by the way, over $800 was raised for our music program, you may remember hearing how Michael Servetus, a forerunner of Unitarian thought in Europe, saw it rather differently. Servetus expressed what theologians call a higher anthropology, or image of the human being, than most of his 16th century contemporaries. In contrast to the doctrine of original sin, he believed children were born innocent. As to the nature of humanity, he wrote that it was of such a character that God can communicate to it divinity, not by a degradation of divinity, but by an exaltation of humanity. Servetus continued, "God sends to us his light, and this is God himself. I say, therefore, that God himself is our spirit dwelling in us." Neither John Calvin nor the Catholic Inquisition leaders that Calvin alerted to this heresy abided by such a sunny view of humanity. And Servetus, who refused to recant, was burned at the stake in 1553. Over time, though, this dramatic death and the reaction to it led to an increase in religious tolerance. And Servetus's writings continued to circulate, leading others to take a second look at some basic Christian doctrines. Traditions with a more positive view of human nature sprang up in Poland, Transylvania, and Britain, and later here in America with our own branch of Unitarianism. The 7 principles that actually I think are on one of your inserts that you have today, though they were articulated after Unitarianism and Universalism merged in the 1960s, and they continue to encapsulate a positive view of humanity, affirming the inherent worth and dignity of every person. Now, to say that each person matters carries a lot of weight, although it's perhaps not as profound a statement as the one that came from the Upanishads. Tat Tvamasi, thou art that. Brahman, the Supreme Self, lives inside of you. But even if our first principle is more understated, it makes a positive, practical difference in how we relate to other people when we live by it. Another way of answering that question, what am I, comes from the economic ideology that so dominates our nation and world today. Here we are cast in the role of consumers as our most important identity. Who am I? Well, one who produces and consumes. Thus, after 9/11, when Americans wondered what positive action they could take to help the nation heal and move forward, Do you remember what President Bush told us to do? Go shopping. People wanted to be contributors in some way to these difficult times, but our leaders could only meekly ask us to be better consumers. Economic materialism may not cast human beings as totally depraved, but it doesn't give us a much better result. Blood diamonds are still around, child labor and slavery in industries like tobacco and chocolate, and of course, the rich getting richer and the middle class shrinking, and life getting harder for large numbers of Americans for decades now. It is simply not enough to be defined as a consumer. Not only because that leaves little room for purpose or meaning or fulfillment in life, but because it leads to the degradation of so many lives. And whenever people are cast in a lower image, suffering is sure to follow. Remember candidate Trump characterizing Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals? And his broad statements conflating gangsters from Latin America with refugees fleeing unimaginable violence. And more recently, of course, we've seen the zero-tolerance policy at the border, leading to the irreversible trauma of children ripped from their mother's arms. I think every mom I've talked to about that has been crying as we've talked about it. I doubt President Trump has a high image of the human being generally, but that question is kind of irrelevant to his views on immigrants and refugees, and I think to many of the people who are emboldened by his rhetoric and actions, because he clearly doesn't regard them as full human beings with the same worth and dignity as himself. More subtle still is the oppression of human beings that comes as a result of our dog-eat-dog economic system and the powers engineering the disenfranchisement of more and more voters through gerrymandering and voter suppression. The unremitting slide away from a democratic, middle-class-based society has been going on for decades as poverty quietly grinds down people of all races. It has gotten harder for many people even to be consumers in the economic machine. In a report titled "The Soul of Poor Folk, Auditing America," the movement known as the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, documents that even as the U.S. economy has grown 18-fold in the past 50 years, at the same time, wealth inequality has expanded. The costs of living have increased, and social programs have been restructured and cut dramatically. Fewer and fewer people in the United States, the richest nation in the world, are afforded a life that respects their health and well-being or their inherent worth and dignity. Popular culture doesn't necessarily offer us much solace from this dim view of the human being. I find myself agreeing with many concerned voices who look at gun violence in America today and point the finger not just at the National Rifle Association and those who fail to regulate guns, culpable as I believe those parties to be, but also at the prevalence of movies, TV, and video games that glorify violence and trivialize life. Now, I can stream old episodes of Star Trek and West Wing if I'm desperate, and I have been, but in this golden age of television, shouldn't there be more options out there that show a positive, hopeful view of humankind? We need access to a higher image of the human being. One of the most effective ways I know to deeply internalize such a positive image is meditation. I'm not speaking of mindfulness meditation, the kind of practice where you observe your mind with detachment. I think you're going to hear more about that next week from Thayer, and incidentally, the blurb is wrong. It's not mediation next week, it's meditation. But I'm speaking today of forms of meditation that hone your powers of concentration, specifically focusing on an elevating idea in words or imagery. Listen to how meditation teacher Eknath Ishran describes what can happen through such a practice. In profound meditation, we drop below the usual preoccupations and become concentrated on one thing and one thing alone, our true identity. And this absorption, this great gathering within, we break through the surface of consciousness and plummet deep, deep into our real nature. What we discover cannot be put into words, but thereafter we are never again the same. With all our consciousness gathered to an intense focus within, the boundaries that seem to separate us from the rest of the world disappear. The duality of subject and object, knower and known, falls away. We are opened to a transcendental mode of knowing. Now, I'm a realist. Probably not everyone is going to take up meditation. But we can all regulate what we are taking into our consciousness through our screens and our earbuds. Ask yourself how much of the media you consume is lifting up a low image of the human being, perhaps even depraved, and how much are you witnessing our finest qualities? I'm not suggesting we shouldn't read some news and be engaged in social problems, but all sources of information are not equal, and we need to pace ourselves on news to nurture our own well-being and foster our capacity to respond to those challenges. Perhaps you have some favorite media sources to go to for a higher image of the human being. I'd love to hear about it, actually, if you do. I like Yes Magazine, which showcases ways many regular people are working creatively for social justice, equity, and the environment. And when I listen to podcasts, I often choose one from the Meta Center for Nonviolence. Their radio show covers the beat of nonviolence, or Soul Force, helping me learn about how people across the country and around the world are working with courage and creativity, using person power to make a difference. I like to listen to that while I'm exercising. That time when you are preparing for sleep is also a good time to feed your mind and heart with uplifting words and positive images of the human being. You might choose from wisdom texts, any that appeal to you, be it the Upanishads, the Bible, the Dhammapada of the Buddha, the Tao Te Ching, the poems of Rumi, or whatever it is that floats your boat. I also love to read about inspiring people, especially when I can find works in their own words. And on that count, by the way, stay tuned for an upcoming class this summer on Gandhi the Man. Another such person for me has been Etty Hillesum. Has anybody read about her? She's pretty amazing. This young woman left behind diaries and letters from the 1930s and 1940s. She started out in Amsterdam, where she lived in a community of Jewish intellectuals, and continues her diaries and her letters through her time working in one of the Nazi work camps. There she offered practical and spiritual support to her companions as fascism marched on until her death at Auschwitz. Now, this might sound like depressing reading. Who wants to read about the Holocaust, right? But it is actually incredibly inspiring. Etty is an absolute original. She is earnest and moody and passionate and real and true to herself. She has a young adult's angst and yearning that in the pages of her diary you witness turning slowly ever more deeply into her spiritual search and a vocation of service to humanity. She's a natural mystic, not inclined at all toward religious language, but instinctively connected to a deeper sense of self. She blossoms in her diary, entry by entry, learning to find her own way, overcoming the limitations of a very human teacher, responding to the challenging circumstances of Nazi occupation and detention, and letting it push her deeper. Now, Etty knew that there was not much she could do about the Nazis. This was a force much bigger than her, bent on the destruction of her people. Even as she copes with the knowledge of the impending doom of their final solution, she tries to enjoy life, to grow spiritually, and to support the people around her. Etty writes, "I feel as if I were the guardian of a precious slice of life, with all the responsibility that entails. There are moments when I feel like giving up or giving in, but I soon rally again and do my duty as I see it, to keep the spark of life inside me ablaze. She faced a challenge that many of us face in difficult times, although to a greater degree than most of us probably. The challenge not to hate the oppressor and so become like them. It's not easy to hold on to the purity of love, to the higher image of a human being, when you see people vividly behaving like brutes. To not let our idealism become warped into cynicism and despair, but to keep our eyes on that vision of who we really are and what is possible if we live from the higher image. Hear more of Eddie's words. When I pray, she writes, I never pray for myself, always for others, or else I hold a silly, naive, and deadly serious dialogue with what is deepest inside me, which for the sake of convenience, I call God. And in one of her written prayers in her diary, she says, I am deeply grateful to you, this deepest part of herself that she calls God for shorthand, for leaving me so free of bitterness and hate. One must understand one's age just as one understands one's contemporaries, for after all, it is of their making. It is what it is, and it must be understood as such, however perplexing it may be. As the Nazis bear down on Europe, page after page in her diary, Etty Hillesum has little hope as an individual of influencing the immediate course of history. Yet she is not hopeless. She's not hopeless. In her conversation with God, she writes, each day is sufficient unto itself. All we can manage these days, and also all that really matters, is that we safeguard that little piece of you, God, in ourselves. We must help you and defend your dwelling place inside us to the last. In other words, if she cannot change the oppressor, she can at least keep them from changing her, from warping her into sharing their dim view of the human being. This is a lesson we can all take from Etty Hillesum. When the voices around us would drive us to a lower and lower image of humanity, it is all the more important to retain a higher image, both for ourselves as people and for those who are suffering the most from dehumanization and violence. At one point in her journal, Etty relays how her friend Liesel tells her about a German soldier who was kind to her. Etty writes to herself after this conversation, I knew at once, I shall have to pray for this German soldier. Out of all those uniforms, one has been given a face now. There will be other faces too, in which we shall be able to read something we understand, that German soldiers suffer as well. She says, there are no frontiers between suffering people, and we must pray for them all. Now, this is an interesting point. Being able to see the human in our so-called enemy is actually part of resisting the degrading of the image of the human being. Let us not become the evil we deplore. Let us not resort to name-calling and ill will. Let us protect our own minds and hearts that they not be distorted by hate from within. And there's one more reason not to hate the oppressor or to burn bridges. Some of those who use harmful rhetoric or even carry out hurtful actions, they just might surprise us, might even reverse their position. Gandhi was able to draw out this potential from some of his enemies in the end. Closer to home, I was pleasantly surprised a few days ago to open up the Star Telegram and read about the actions of one of our local political leaders. Representative Kay Granger doesn't often vote or lead in ways that align with my values, at least that I've noticed. and she doesn't seem very accessible to citizens. But she is speaking up against the separation of families at the border. And she speaks with some knowledge and influence about how we might get at the root cause by addressing the awful violence and the hopeless situations in their home countries that are leading people to undertake perilous journeys in the hope of finding refuge here. She's speaking like one who cares about people and recognizes their worth and dignity. So I respect Representative Granger's leadership on this issue, and I want to support it. And I want to leave the door open to others acting on principle and setting more humane policies, even when it goes against the currents in their party or among their base. Within our own hearts and minds and within our nation, let us remember who we really are. May we lift up a higher image of humanity so that all may one day live in peace, safety, and love. May it be so. Amen.